I just upgraded my dust collection system in the shop, and I wanted to show you why and how I implemented it. So let's get started. So in my last video, we tested out some small shop dust cyclones using a shop vac and a dust extractor, but today we're gonna focus on the Mini Gorilla by Oneida Air Systems. Now there are a ton of dust collectors out there with just as many ducting solutions, but the cool thing about the Mini Gorilla is that it sits on a mobile base, which is great for me in my shop because it's easy for me to move around if I need to get from tool to tool. It has 3 legs with a caster on each and is easy to slide around on concrete floors. It has an easy to access on-off switch here at the top. So if you're using it near a tool, you can easily access the on-off switch without much difficulty. This is a 220 volt motor, but they also have a 110 volt option available, and both are 1.5 horsepower. Not to mention, it's made in the USA, which is a huge bonus. And the other cool thing about this dust collector is that it has a 99.97% dust collection efficiency, meaning that it can capture anything up to 0.03 microns. So when we're talking about air filtration, this thing is fantastic. And because the Mini Gorilla has a filter, it's not like the bagged models, which are gonna send a lot of those fine particles back up into the air. So let's get started hooking this thing up and updating the hoses and the attachments around the shop, and we'll talk a little bit more about the features along the way.
So the first thing I needed to do was get out all of my hoses and connections. For this, I'll be using some 4-inch flex hose as well as the Rockler quick connections. And I went with the quick connection just because it makes things easier when going from tool to tool. And I have 2 different flex hoses here, one that expands and one that doesn't. For the majority of this setup, I'll be using the expandable one, which is 21 feet when extended and 3 feet when collapsed. So I started at the thickness planer, where the first step was to remove the old 4 to 2 inch reducers. Now I went with the elbow here instead of a straight fitting to help get the hose out of the way of any boards that are being planed, which is one of the things we went over in the planer tune-up video. There's nothing worse than trying to manage your hose while you're thicknessing some boards. One thing to consider is that these 90-degree elbows do pivot, so you may need to add some tape to lock it into place. But I mean, if elbows didn't bend, they'd have no point. Anyway, next I focused on the drum sander, and for this I just used a straight fitting. And these fittings are really easy to add and remove. The rubber boot creates a nice tight seal, while the port itself actually pivots so it can easily adjust to the hose. One tool that was in desperate need of a dust collection upgrade was my joiner. So I went with another straight fitting here again, which worked out perfectly. My joiner and my planer create the most amount of chips in the shop, so I'm really looking forward to having a dust collector that can keep up. And with an estimated CFM of 583 at the tool, the Mini Gorilla should do just fine. And just to make sure there's no monkey business there, we'll check that CFM here in a minute. So next up was my table saw, and I had to make an impromptu splice using one of my old fittings. And to do that, I just used my bandsaw and cut off the 2-inch reducer. This way I could use my table saw's existing flex hose and just splice on the connection. They do sell splice connectors just for this reason, but since I already had these old connectors in the shop, I figured I may as well cut them down and use them. So next up was the quick change handle, and I'll admit getting the hose around this one was a little tricky, so just take your time. And while we have a moment, please give this video a like. I really appreciate it. So with the handle attached, I could focus on the other end, which is going to be my 5-inch to 4-inch reducer. Now I'm using a 5-inch hose to come off of the dust collector, just to maintain that larger volume as long as I can. And this is a 10-foot metal coiled hose, so it'll help extend the reach. And then to help ground it, I stripped away a small section and made sure it made contact with the reducer. This should dissipate any static charge that's built up inside of the hose. I just used some metal pliers to bend the wire until it made good contact, then wrapped some electrical tape around it to ensure it stayed in place. And I can tell you that after testing this that it worked. Shockingly well. Alright, so with the reducer attached to my 5-inch hose, I could attach it to the 4-inch hose. And a lot like the table saw, I used a splice in combination with a rubber coupler. This is one of those situations where you gotta get a little innovative in the shop. Let me know about any of your weird dust collection connections down in the comments. So with my stretcher flex hose finally assembled, I could attach it to the Mini Gorilla. And again, to do that, I'm just attaching the 5-inch hose to the machine. The idea here again is to keep that larger run of hose for as long as possible, as a 5-inch hose can carry about 2 times the amount of air when compared to a 4-inch hose. The last major connection to make was the bandsaw, and to do that I'm going to cut down some of this extra 4-inch flex hose. So once I've used some snips to cut the plastic, I just use a razor blade to separate the two. And because my bandsaw has 2 ports, I'm going to be using one of these Y fittings to bring it to a single connection. And I forgot to mention it earlier, but I do prefer using these thumb screw versions of the hose clamps, as they're a lot less tedious than the bolted version for small spaces. Just make sure you put them over your hose prior to stretching them over your fittings, otherwise you got to finagle them across the entire hose and that's no fun. Alright, so with our 2 hoses attached, I could attach the quick connection port to the opposite end. And again, this went on just like the others did with a couple cranks of the ratchet. From there, it was time to connect the hose ends to the ports on the bandsaw. Now this lower port was a little tricky to access, but that's where the thumb screw bands really come in handy. Once the hose was fully seated, it was easy to crank it down. From there, I attached my longer opposite end to the upper port. And hey, if you're enjoying this video, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for your support. So once I'd rotated the hose so a nice fit, I locked it down. Here I was just trying to orient the Y so that it had a minimal amount of friction and had the best possible airflow. So with all my hoses connected, I decided to take it for a spin. And the bandsaw is usually one of those culprits that spits out a lot of sawdust, but as you can see with the mini gorilla hooked up, the amount of dust was negligible, which means it's going full in on its namesake, collecting dust. So earlier I mentioned that this had an actual CFM rating of 583, and I gotta say with the testing I did, that number was spot on. And 583 CFM is plenty adequate for any tool in my shop. To store the hose, I'm just gonna stick it on the end of my drum sander rather than build anything, because it's pretty conveniently placed in my shop. One addition I did make was adding an Ivac Pro remote switch, just because then I can use the machine remotely if I choose to. And setting it up was pretty straightforward using the included instructions. My only gripe is that the switch is the size of a 99 Nokia. So overall, I gotta say I'm really happy with the mini gorilla and its setup. It has a nice viewport and the 22-gallon barrel, so I don't have to worry about the chips overflowing, easy to move non-marring casters, and changing out the bags from the dustbin isn't all that difficult either. Just unhook the 3 clips, remove your bag, hook them back up, and you're right back to work. And because it's made in America, you know it's gonna work. So yeah, this machine is an incredibly mobile powerhouse. Plus it has top-tier filtration that's easy to clean out with a little bit of compressed air, making the dust suck just a little less.
So if you're looking for a mobile dust collector for your small shop that's got a lot of power and won't break the bank, definitely check out the Mini Gorilla by Oneida Air Systems. I think it fits the bill. And if you enjoyed this video, check out this video over here next. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and I'll see you next time.